for the, I think, the 20th round of CCT conversations, and I think uh, Sonal will be the 200th or 210th speaker for this in this series. So the CCT conversations are uh, an initiative of the School of Environment and Architecture uh, to create a public platform around architecture and its allied fields. And one of the agendas is to kind of uh, disseminate new thinking, emerging thinking on architecture and various dimensions of spatiality. So and it has had a variety of speakers, uh, all kinds of designers and various kinds of practitioners from all around the world. Uh, Usually the monsoon semester happens online and the winter semester happens offline like this. But then this one is also available on YouTube channel of the institution. So my name is Prasad Shetty. Uh, I'll welcome again all of you over here as well as in the on who's following us on the YouTube channels uh, for this for the first talk in this series of in this cycle of the CCT conversation. Uh, it's called the Bookmakers. The uh, texts and space has a very unclear and uncertain relationship. I mean, there are we find spaces getting described through texts, uh, spaces. Uh, uh, the illustration of text happens through space, and theater becomes a very important kind of a instrument or a ladder to kind of uh, put the two together, the idea of space and text. And we see it in plays, in variety of things. In this school, also, as a part of the first year, one of the key methods that we use is theater uh, to understand this relationship between text and space, because text also kind of, I mean, the familiarity with text or spoken language, written language, uh, is a little bit uh, more. It's a little bit more than the familiarity with space in terms of its articulation. Like we are able to say things clearly, uh, you know, uh, uh, about phenomena, and the experience of it getting articulated in language it's usually difficult. So what we do is we use texts from a variety of sources, and we use it to kind of think space, and that kind of usually becomes a theater performance. So we've been doing that since last 9 years, 10 years as a pedagogic instrument to understand the experience of space. The ladder of text is used. In this series, we've invited people who've worked with text. We've, we've invited people who've worked with non-fiction, with fiction, translators, biographers, uh, people who collect texts, collect books. So the series is full of people who've been working with text and books. Bookmaker is a fairly loose word, who kind of people who've made books, but also who've kind of loved books and the idea of book as in as not only a physical kind of a object but also a conceptual tool. Uh, the in the first talk we have with us uh, Sonal Mithal, who jointly with Arul Paul uh, has has a recent publication, a queer reading of Nawabi architecture and colonial archive, Lucknow Queerscapes, which is published by Routledge this year, 2024. Copies of which are there, and we will kind of talk about this book more in detail. There is, you know, uh, there is scholarship of a certain kind when it comes to Indian architecture. Usually has been about, there have been, I mean, the colonial scholarship has been largely stylistically oriented, So and there are ways in which people have written about architecture earlier, and the the post-colonial writings have been around the question of identity in many ways. So a fundamental reading of architecture, or a real reading of architecture, has been very little, very less. Uh, how architecture connects to life, really, which has been the key focus of this institution, is something which is actually not there. Very scanty understanding, and in many ways, I think this book is 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 a scholarship which is pointing at that direction. We have a few very good scholars, recent new scholars who are emerging across the country, who are taking up this issue of connecting physicality or spatiality with uh, uh, life, or its practices, behavior, experiences, the rituals of life, routines. And this book, in many ways, uh, does that. It's an important book uh, by uh, of a very important city, I must say. And we know of Lucknow. I mean, there are now few films set on Lucknow also. Uh, the older films, which was based from Lucknow, Shatranj Ke Khiladi, which is based from Lucknow, but it doesn't have much of Lucknow in it. But you get a sense of 1856, 1857 from, and it kind of situates one of the most important personalities that this book picks up, Wajid Ali Shah, the Nawab of Lucknow, the last Nawab of Lucknow. So that's an important kind of, and then there are plenty of new movies which are located in Lucknow. And whenever I've been to Lucknow, the imambadas and the mosques uh, and the um, bulbulayas and the whole series of architectural kind of objects, they're fascinated. But the thing is that there is a certain uniqueness to them. There is a certain strangeness in them, and you always feel that. There is always something strange about Lucknowi Nawabi architecture, and and the colonial writers have not picked up on that. That strangeness, that difference, because it breaks order in many ways. It breaks kind of uh, usual. It doesn't let you to kind of frame it within the stylistic thinking even. So, and it's difficult, and I think what this book does is specifically kind of helps us articulate on that, conceptualize on that strangeness of architecture. uh, I'm going to quickly read uh, the biographies of two authors who've jointly written this book. Sonal Mithal, who's with us. She's an architect, artist, and an educator. She holds a doctorate from University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, the master's from SPA Delhi, and bachelor's of architecture from Lucknow University. She is co-founder of research and conservation studio People for Heritage Concern, which offers consultancy for conservation and urban revitalization projects and art projects for public sector. She is serving as chair of the Masters in Conservation and Regeneration program at CEPT University. Her research, teaching, and writing transects architecture, landscape architecture, queer studies, history, and architectural conservation. Her areas of interest are architecture approaches for architectural approaches for climate change, feminist materialism, and intersectionality, which is central to shaping the built environment. Arul Paul is an architect and educator currently serving as an associate professor at the Nitte Institute of Architecture in Mangalore. Their research explores the intersection of architecture, urbanism, history, and queer studies. Paul holds a master's in history, theory, criticism, and urban design from CEPT and a bachelor's of architecture from Anna University, Chennai. Through the lens of history and theory, he critically examines the evolution of pedagogy in response to emerging challenges and innovations, contributing to academia, research, writing, and practice. Committed to social justice and equality, they actively champion these values for all, regardless of gender and sexual orientation. The book is titled, frankly, as The Queer Reading of Nawabi Architecture and Colonial Archive, Lucknow Queerscapes. I mean, I don't know if you all are familiar with uh, the, the the nawabs of Lucknow. I mean, and the two nawabs that the book kind of looks closely at their lives are Asaf-ud-daula and Wajid Ali Shah, and and they're both controversial in many ways for the colonial writers, and I think I think uh, this book kind of uh, opens these two nawabs very differently for us actually, and very generously, uh, very sensitively, uh, it kind of locates them and their cultural expressions. Sonal.
Okay. Thank you, Prasad, for such a kind and generous introduction. And thank you all. Thank you, everybody at sea, for having me. I'm really delighted to share this project with you. And whatever I say will also be on behalf of Arul, who has been with me. Both of us have been, it is our project jointly. And so, I mean, I'm sensing Paul to be with me here. So whatever I say, Paul is also saying that. Um, Thank you once again. So the way the talk, like I'm not very used to giving book talks. This is like one of the first ones, so bear with me. It might be just like all over the place. I have a presentation, I also have the book, and sometimes it may just like be, impromptu. I'm relying a lot on your feedback and your comments and questions that you may have, and that might just spark something more because um, there's a lot that we want to say, but it's just so much that we can compress in this, consolidated time. So, as Prasad has already said, the book actually started with, it's about two Nawabs, Asaf-ud-daula and Wajid Ali Shah, in Lucknow. And so it's like, why these two Nawabs and why Lucknow? It all started with like, I'm from Lucknow, so definitely there was that some affinity, and I think that is where I'm also drawing upon what is been the thematics of the panels in the 2 days. Like, you just draw upon your own positionalities in geographies. So, but reading through the architectural history books, which are the normative ones, like, say, for example, Percy Brown, like that's what we studied when I was a student. um, there was and also like reading a lot of reports as I was getting trained into conservation architecture. I was getting access to these writings by the archaeologists, the British archaeologists, like Cunningham, Cousins, and also, for that matter, Ferguson. And they very emphatically write like, Taj Mahal is beautiful, and so they write about a lot of buildings in India from a colonial orientalist position, and they write about specifically Lucknow architecture as something which is vulgar and debased, and these are words that are quote unquote verbatim, like, so, and that kind of legitimized in a certain way why there is no need to include these buildings in the um, archaeological inventory of the British, the colonial project, the enterprise of the colonization project. Now, it's all right, you don't include it. But what happens is that our discourse on architectural history drew so much upon that work that it kind of reinforced that exclusion. And and I think Shatranj Ke Khiladi is a very good example. And somebody like they recently published an excerpt from the book, and one of the editors, they said, you have to make the connection between Shatranj Ke Khiladi and Wajid. And we did not want to make the connection in the book because we just did not want to acknowledge the fact that it has been very incorrectly represented in the book, and because it has such a big reach, it again kind of legitimizes. So if you're not familiar, I'll take this opportunity to like use Shatranj Ke Khiladi because it's a popular this thing. So it shows Wajid Ali Shah, and it is like Shatranj Ke Khiladi. Shatranj is that motif which goes on while the War of Independence 1857 is going on, and it showcases the people of Lucknow that are just so disconnected from that war that they just keep playing shatranj. And Wajid is, invoked in the beginning, and it's all his doing, and he's like shown as a king who doesn't care. And it's like a piece, Awadh is shown as a piece of cake that he just slices off and gives to the crown as and when it's required so that nobody touches him. And that is the popular narrative that has just sustained and reinforced for a very long time. And so Ajit is shown as something who doesn't care, not responsible, and effeminate, and so on. And whatever he builds is also vulgar, debased, and so on and so forth. And that was a problem, and that prompted our project that let's now start looking at where did this narrative start to build. And so we are tracing back and we are looking into the archives. So that is why we're using the word a reading of the archive. And then why queer reading of the archive comes from the um, the identities or the performativities of both the individuals, Asaf-ud-daula and Wajid Ali Shah. And so Asaf-ud-daula is um, he is admittedly and publicly homosexual, and Wajid is like, he's amorous in his display of the politics. So he performs what he calls ishq, which is an overlap of the political and the personal. And so, whether it is his transaction with his lovers, which are like numerous and of many genders, or his transaction with his political allies or his political, opponents, his transaction is in the nature of ishq, which is which derives itself from its ability to manipulate. Hmm? And that overlap and that theatricity plays out on a day-to-day basis in these two nawabs. There are more nawabs, and we wanted to write about three, but the word count didn't allow, so I'll not speak about that part of the thing. But again, just like to highlight the fact that because these nawabs, like, and I want to draw upon some of the conversations that have been happening in the panels, like um, what is queer, and there is some amount of queerness in every individual, and the queer is always already there. What is very unique about these nawabs is that they were at the power position of power, and they were hence able to perpetuate a certain culture of a queer, what you would now call queer culture. That word did not exist at the time, which the British considered one inappropriate, and also they were just very discomforted by it. And that capacity to discomfort what is wanting to be at the power is something which is very important for us to understand. Um, uh, this queer culture that the Nawabs were perpetuating. And and because of that agency, because of that power that they had, because they were the rulers, uh, the queer culture became so banal and so commonplace in Lucknow that it almost became the norm. And that is what was the problem for the British. And that is why it becomes very important. Lucknow becomes a very important um, political entity, geographical entity, and architectural entity to start looking at queer systems and queer projects, and also using queer as a method to then read how these archives had been created. So I'll begin, like, so both Asaf and Wajid were writers, poets, and so he says, Asaf is saying, Ishq mein aisi khichi ruswai ho gaya shor ja bacha dil ka. And he's like, he, he has written a lot of poems and they are all online, but there is a sheer lack of scholarship on, and these poems, if you read, you can see the his desires and his amorous desires, also his homosexuality, which emerges very strongly in these poems. And he talks about dishonor, isolation, and basically isolation that he feels because of his orientation. And similarly, just Wajid Ali Shah, this poem we do mention in the book, but I just took the liberty of putting this poem, although it's not mentioned in the book. हूरो परी को रश्क था एक शख्स पर बेमिसाल थे सभी माही सीमाए Lucknow. See, he was in love with Lucknow actually, and he was like, angels and goddesses were envious of every citizen, incomparable was everyone in the glorious Lucknow. This is something he wrote when he was thrown out, and the British deposed him and he sent away to Kolkata, and he was very miserable. He recreated the Kesar Bagh in Kolkata, but this thing. So I would move forward, but I want you to pay attention to the image here. And this is our invitation of how do you start reading the images, and how do you read these images, who commissioned them, and then how do you um, read these images in relation to what is written in the archives. So in the image, this is commissioned by Wajid. You can see the ornate shoes he's wearing, and and you can also see the slit in his kurta. This is how he wanted to represent himself. It is commissioned by him. Um, but if you read in the archives, at some point, the British had insisted that the Nawabs, uh, they have to stop, they have to wear black shoes, black leather shoes. because for political reasons they are now allies of the British, and they were like also asserting their power and so on and so forth. So the Wajid did not have he was not able to circumvent that requirement. But what he did was he was very aware of his representation and how he's shown in the public. So from that time onwards, whatever paintings he was getting commissioned for himself, he did not show the shoes. So they are like only up till the upper part of the body. And so this is a very, a way to circumvent the requirement in a certain way, because he was aware that these things may just proliferate and like reach a larger segment of the larger population. He was very much aware of that propagation of images and what he wrote and this, that, and the other. And this was his way of circumventing that political requirement. So, um, what is queer? Queer refers to the non-normative as a deviation from normative practices of gender and sexuality. And it often refers to those who occupy the margins, not dominant and with limited political control. But here, it's very important that both Wajid and Asif were, there in the center. They were at the margins when it came in relation to the British. So it's always relational because the power quotient keeps shifting. Queer agency is that of subversion. And I've already spoken about this thing, so I'll not go into the detail. Um, I've already spoken. So Asif grew up being ridiculed by his father, tutor, playmates, and later Warren Hastings for his sexuality. He was often fat shamed. In his poetry, Asif wrote about his loneliness, his feeling of social isolation, and so on. And like his poetry, his architectural productions, such as the Aina Khana, to counter the fat shaming, Asif surrounded himself with mirrors at his Aina Khana, meaning mirror house. Now, don't confuse the Aina Khana with the generic Sheesh Mahal, because the Sheesh Mahal is mirrors and it's meant to reflect, and there's some amount of celebratoriness to that. But the Aina Khana was a collection of objects, and it was kind of a museum without it being called a museum, where it, he collected a lot of things from all over the world, like clocks, watches, um, machines, toys, models of ships, and whatnot. But he also collected a lot of mirrors. And he placed those mirrors in the rooms in various ways. And just to invoke, we do invoke Aaron Betsky's call to the use of mirror in a queer space, where there is these multiplicities of spaces that start emerging. And to, to use that to imagine what the Aina Khana, what was Asif trying to do through the Aina Khana was that he countered the fat shaming by surrounding himself with mirrors at his Aina Khana, where he not only celebrated his body by encountering his reflection all the time, but also made his guests encounter it multiple times, because he was calling all the British officers and so on and so forth to come and look at the Aina Khana. This is my collectibles. He kept collectibles from all over the world and invited the European guests. This way, he ensured that the ones who detested his body had to endure its myriad reflections in that building. So it's like, you can't escape that. And then what you find in the archives is that the British like just complaining, what is this Aina Khana? We don't want to see that so many mirrors and so on and so forth. So you see in the archives, you see the discomfort and the complaining. And so in the reading, we see, okay, what was Asif probably trying to do is do precisely that, discomfort the colonial gaze. And similarly, I've already spoken about the ishq in terms of Wajid. Wajid created spaces that were self-referential, because I think we were talking about somebody in the first panel today, like what is the power and where's the center? Like how do you what does it mean to queer the city? And it is like if the city is already queer. So it is about where do you locate the centrality. And we draw a lot upon Sarah Ahmed's idea of geographies and directions and locations. So if you position yourself, the, the location, the center, where it is, and if things are focused onto that, automatically the power shifts towards you. So Wajid was very aware of that, and he created spaces that were self-referential and overtly theatrical, as we'll see in the case of Kesar Bagh, and that allowed for the performance of the ishq, which was his unique way of combining politics and love. To perform ishq, he had to be perpetually in a theatrical state, and just keep these words in mind. It's perpetual. It's on a day-to-day basis. He had to be seen, and he had to be able to see all. The gardens, the garden pavilion, and the residential units surrounding the central court at Kesar Bagh thus became devices through which he would satiate his theatrical desire. So these are the ways in which both the Nawabs were kind of, you know, um, performing their interest. So, how are we defining the queer architecture? Now, when we looked into the archives, we found these terms, which are in quotation marks, like eccentric, peculiar. Now, these are terms, these are synonyms of the word queer, if you look into the thesaurus. But these are terms that are found in the Colonial Archive for Lucknow architecture. And if you read the book, we have all the citations of where these words are picked up from. Eccentric, peculiar, bizarre, fantastical, phantasmagoric, outrageous, atrocious, outlandish, deceptive. So these are the words that we found, and queer studies allows us to reclaim those terms. So in reclaiming those terms, it helps us present the Nawabs and Nawabi architecture that offered spectacular contestations and resistance to the colonial eye by always remaining outside of their comprehension. Um, we present Nawabi architecture as that which discomforts necessarily the colonial writer, and that is precisely the salient feature that we qualify as queer. And so again, invoking Sarah Ahmed, she uses queer in two forms. First, which is oblique or offline, and second, which is non-straight sexual practice or all that is deviant. So her scholarship supports us in seeking merit in architectural terms such as disorganization. Like we are all very familiar with organization, order, and things like that. So we are interested in disorganization. We are interested in disorientation and non-alignment. Now, you also know that these are also political terms which challenge the ubiquity of order in architectural discourse. So we also use Ahmed valorizes strange because it challenges familiarity. So like Prasad, you use the word strange. And for Sarah Ahmed and for queer studies, strange is a very important thing because it challenges familiarity. And if Nawabi architecture is strange to the colonial eye, it carries within it the ability to subvert the colonial view. It's like, again, repeating the same thing. But we use this idea of familiarity and unfamiliarity a lot because Asaf had moved from Faizabad to Lucknow to create his capital in Lucknow. He was not the first Nawab, but he was the first Nawab to have Lucknow as his capital. And so he landed in an unfamiliar ground and made it familiar, and in that sense, we are also reading how he did that. Queer studies have reclaimed words such as deviant and strange, as I just said, to imply an empowered meaning which expresses a distancing from the mainstream and is cogent precisely because of that. So I'll not dwell into these things. These are just more examples of what James Ferguson is writing in Sydney Hay, and basically from the Colonial Archive, which says bad things, and they are highlighted. So it's like I'll just let this go. And these are the various words that we found. These are all the words and many more that we were able to find in the archives. These are not just synonyms. And so you can see the immensity and the disdain that the European writers had for Lucknow architecture. So unchaste, self-indulgent, frivolous, dissolute, cannot pursue a straight path, and all these things, pervert. So these are terms for the Nawabs as well as their architecture. So the book, it has two parts to it. One is the dragging up the past, and the second is Lucknow Queerscapes. And um, I would invite you to read all of it. But if you have just interest, like very isolated interest, you can read either part and then do it. So the first part is basically contextualizing Lucknow architecture, contextualizing the politics, the Nawabs. Also, like it is the part where we discuss the archives, the colonial archive. We also discuss what was the archives that the what we call the counter archive, which the Nawabs created to counter, and they were very vehemently, assertively, and intentionally creating those counter archives to counter the dominant British discourse and ensuring that it floods the citizenship, both in India as well as in England. So, counter archives is that chapter, and locating inaccuracies, fallacies, biases in the colonial archives, like where we see something written in the archive and then we find instances that it's not true. Mm. And contesting, first two chapters are basically just setting the tone, like what Lucknow is and so on. Querying the colonial archives and contesting colonial claims is basically positioning the book using queer studies and queer theory. Now, how and so Lucknow Queerscapes is something which is very special about this project, where we are recreating, reconstructing the um, erased footprint of the architectures by both the Nawabs. So something that I didn't mention is during the uprising, 1857 uprising, the British won and the Nawabs lost. So Wajid was deposed, but the entire city was destroyed in an extremely violent manner. I wouldn't say the entire city, they were like targeted um, de demolitions that happened. And we found some maps um, which were actually created to capture the city. And in those maps, they have positioned where the cannons will position themselves and where they are supposed to target. So you can see the bomb or that cannonball dropping, and you can see like, all right, this has to be destroyed. So we are using that map to actually see what was the nature of intention demolition, and it's very much targeting Kesar Bagh and Machi Bhavan. So most of these precincts do not exist. So we recreate using those maps, the colonial maps, which were meant to destroy, to actually then recreate what was. So 7 and 8 chapter is doing that, just a description. So if like somebody, we had like a chat and we were laughing about it. We never wanted to write a travelogue of Lucknow, but it can be read like that. So somebody took chapter 8 and chapter 7 to go and travel to places and like do that. So I think here is where we would also like to emphasize the agency of queer studies to also do that. In the rewriting of the history, you're also recreating something, and there is like so much of commitment to that. And then the 9, 10, and 11 chapters are actually giving a vocabulary of what was the nature of that architecture. So we are saying that it was theatrical, it had a vaudeville variety, it was a variety intensive. And then within that, we have that architecture had ambiguity, it had plurality, theatricity. And then there are all these are various examples of little things that happen in the architectural objects, like windows, doors, thresholds, and so on. And then we have perverse compositions that subvert the idea of order and stylistic ways of looking at things. Here we are also looking at the gaze, and similarly of intentions and obscurations, in which there are these places where a lot of tensions come about in terms of homosocial spaces and jealousies that get invoked, especially in the case of Vajid, because he's creating that place where women have to just focus onto him, but then there are these jealousies that get invoked and so on and so forth. And that's about it. So just going, we also want to emphasize that this is a methods book, and not, but in the process the history gets written, in the process a travelogue gets written, but necessarily it's a methods book. and we are inviting all our readers to use it to like write histories, queer histories of other cities and other places as well. So we do a very methodical, like it follows what you would call an extremely normative method of um, laying out what we found in the archives. This is the Colonial Archives on a timeline versus the nawabs, the governors, the archival text against the imagery, against the illustrators and writers who were coming, against the counter archive, which is very limited, which you can see at the bottom. But putting it on a timeline, we are able to see like what happened at what time, and it just helps us spatialize the, the construction of um, the narrative. And so Ishaq is very much happening in the 1950s when it was like 1850s when it was building up to the war. So more of these timelines. Our queer reading reads the colonial texts, maps, paintings, photographs to make explicit the vantage points of the colonial eye, the embedded voice of the nawabs revealing what they thought, how they acted, how they offered resistance to the colonial ingress, and in what ways they discomforted the colonial power. In short, we are committed to reading the agency that the nawabs exerted through the colonial archive, even when the colonial archive is silent on that. Just a little word on the counter archives. You know, like Shatranj ke Khiladi, the dominant narrative was Wajid was no good. But Wajid uh, created this book called the Catechism. And as the name suggests, it's a series of questions related to Awad answered. Now, there is Awad Catechism is an invocation of the religiosity, and again, I want to acknowledge that this question of religiosity came up in the panel today in the morning, and it's a very important point. Both the Nawabs, Asaf and Wajid, were extremely religious, and they were using that religion to support what they wanted to do, and honestly so. And so catechism is also like drawing upon the religiosity and the people's commitment to their religion. So what is written in a catechism is like taken by its word. So it's written in the format of a series of questions related to our answers. These answers are sometimes sarcastic, sometimes funny, and sometimes reveal the malpractices of the English East India Company. For example, to a question asking how did the EIC acquire their power in Awadh, the answer is by gradual encroachment and interference effected by means of residence. That is the answer. And that is what Wajid is writing. He's not a stupid guy, as you know, the dominant discourse. This is what he is getting published. And so what is the resident is answered in the catechism. An officer appointed by the company at the court of a native prince, ostensibly to advise him, but really to promote mismanagement and confusion in his dominions, and thus afford plausible excuses and opportunities for the English taking possession of them. Now, this is something Wajid is getting written, and it's written in the Indian News and Chronicle of Eastern Affairs, April 28, 1857. It's being published and circulated in London. And that was his reach. So that is the counter archive. So Wajid was not a fool at all. Now, this is a very interesting painting. This is how the Nawabs were being depicted by the colonial painters. This is by Johann Zufani. And you can see Wajid, sorry, this is Asaf-ud-daula, this one. Huh? He's in the center, and there is like some kind of an amorous orientation between this and this white guy. He's called Colonel John Mordaunt. It's like very flippantly, the archive says that they were like inclined towards each other and so on, but not necessarily so. It wasn't very clear. So there is a very sarcastic imagery of them being in a very vaudeville situation, which is the cockfight. And you can see through the way the muslin folds are being depicted in Asaf. It's a state of arousal. It's also very satirical. But then all the Europeans are sitting and looking at them in disdain from a vantage point. And these were the images that were then getting circulated. So this is how we are reading these archival images to see what was the construction um, of Nawab Asaf as somebody who is not quote unquote capable of being a ruler. Uh, this is an imagery which Wajid commissioned for Kesar Bagh. And so you can see that it is an extension of the palace. Sorry. This was the palace. Again, contrary to the popular narrative or memory, Kesar Bagh was not the palace, it was the garden, and as the name suggests, it was the Bagh. And this was the palace, this was the Bagh in which the perpetual theatricity played out day in and day out for months together. And this is one of the scenes of a Mela. And Wajid, you can see he's on his way to the procession and he will go all around and then go into the city and so on and so forth. Um, and so this is just want to remind, like one thing I want to draw attention to. So you can see that there are a lot of kiosks, and this is called the Lanka. It derives itself from the city, the Lanka, and which appears very strongly in the Ramayana. So this was the setting for a perpetual play to play out when there is like that story of he was very much interested in these mythological stories, and he also wrote poetry and ballet forms and things like that, and all these pavilions would feature as settings for those those theatrical performances. What I would also like to bring to your attention, and this is where I would also like bring in Paul, because that was his reading of the place, and he's like, this periphery was where the women of the Kesar Bagh would live. Now, by women, it's like they were all trainees into the Kathak school that Wajid had started, and they were on a contract here to learn Kathak and so on. So here they were all there, and they would be able to look into this to this space. Now, this space, because it was the theatrical space, Wajid would meet all the European British residents and all in this center, Safed Baradari. To come and meet Wajid, who positions himself in the center, the British residents have to walk through into that space, which is surrounded on all sides by this very feminized uh, women. Uh, and these are, if you read through the text, you will say that people are, British are complaining, oh, these, we can't like understand what this is and all that, and eyes are on us and so on. So they're aware of that gaze, that the reversed gaze that gets projected onto the people who then have to be in this. So coming back to that idea that Wajid had to be seen, but he could not see all at the same time. Um, the blindness that was like, the opacity that the British encountered was very important here. So we are reading two things, Parikhana and Ishaqnama. Ishaqnama was a painted, illustrated manuscript that Wajid commissioned, and it was happening at the same time that the Kesar Bagh was getting constructed. So although it may not have images of the Kesar Bagh, we are still using it to derive the aesthetics and the politics of Wajid Ali Shah. And you can see that Parikhana is a story of this. The Paris were actually the trainees that he had. Um, so let me know if I'm running out of time. I'll just like stop. So see, this is again a painting from Ishaqnama, and where again like how the strategy that Wajid had was through the written word, like our catechism, also through the painted word. And he didn't care, like, for him it was not incorrect to be like be in love with like 350 women and many more, and it was not, that was not his concern. For him that was the norm, and so he was putting himself out there, um, and that was inappropriate for everybody else, but he didn't care about that. What he cared was his political representation. So here you see the shoes are not there. And this is also like the British also said, we are giving you some, yearly money to sustain yourself and so on and so forth, and these are our conditions. And one of the conditions is like, you guys are spend a lot of money on the army, so you cannot keep an army. And so anyways, they were a feminized culture. They were not interested in wars. Like, you would not hear of any nawab of Lucknow having fought, except for, I think, Shuja'ud-daula, but they were not necessarily interested in fighting. What he did is like, all right, but he was very interested in countering that narrative. So he positions himself in this painting at the top of a building, which is his imagination of the Kesar Bagh. And you can see the soldiers, they are all white. And who is leading them is a Khwaja Sara who lies outside of the binary, the gender binary. And so he appointed Khwaja Saras in very high positions of power. And so you can see the representation. And, behind him is also like the caretaker. So he is in a position where he's dressed like an army man. And then the hierarchies play out. He's like subverting those hierarchies. So the one who are being trained are the white guys. And he circulates this image. So, and later he appointed a small army of women and trained them and so on and so forth. And you will also see how he gave very poetic names to his cavalry and regiments, such as Maka, Tircha, Gangor, Naktari, which are all very poetic, as well as, dance moves and things like that. So we studied two places, Machi Baba and Kesar Bagh. These are just zoom-ins. And so how are we querying the archives and reconstructing the erasures? So you can see, like, this is imagery, and these are also, I would again like to remember Paul here, like the annotations are in his hand, the red ones, like these ones. So you can see a large part of it is all white. It's all, you can see it's demolition. That's the colonial map. And these are all annotations drawn in Paul's hand here, which is like reading many images again from the archives to rebuild what it was. So it has taken a lot of, careful reading, like hours and hours of like paying attention to small things to draw these. And just to invoke one thing, this Felice Piatto was a war photographer. Many of you may have heard of him, but he was commissioned by the British. Like, he was also sent for the Crimean War to just take photographs of those territories that the British have like acquired. And so he did a lot of staging of the places that were. There's a lot of staging that happened in Lucknow, and this scholar called Yaqeen Kinger has recently come out. It was an awarded paper that wrote about the baghs in Lucknow, um, in which the staging appeared, in which the carcasses and the cadavers of people who were fallen were like staged to show the British the victory. And so we're drawing on those kind of images to actually see like what is in the backdrop, and let's build back what they destroyed. So these things, I'll just skip this. It's a little bit more argumentative, like why are we using, so we draw plans eventually, and so why are we making plan like drawings, and what does familiarity, allow us to do, and our skills and tools as architects and so on and so forth. And also coming back to the point that we are wanting to still remain within the discipline and use its tools that are, familiar, but creating unfamiliar um, this narratives. So we are able to construct to this detail the Machi Bhavan with like 59 structures. And these are the kind of archival drawings and images that we have found, which have helped us do that. So we have spent hours looking at this structure, does not appear here, and this structure appears here, but it is nowhere to be seen. So how do we, you know, uh, conclude that maybe some other building came up, so we have to look at some other map and so on and so forth. So these kind of things. And this is the Felice Piatto panorama, these drawings, images. This is an incomplete painting that we found, and then we are looking at these structures, like something is in faint here. So a lot of time has been spent, and I would again like bring back our attention to the nature of our project, which has been extremely collaborative. And I cannot thank enough uh, to have this opportunity to work in a collaborative environment, because I don't think so this project would have been possible if there were not like two sets of people talking to each other constantly and like, brainstorming. All right, do you see this? Do you see that? And so on and so forth. Um, so these things, there have been like, Daniel Thomas' View of the Palace Garden with Trees and Figures and Enclosed by Walls is the title of the thing. And nobody till now has been able to place where this thing is, but we have been able to locate with a lot of conviction where it would have been. And again, I would reiterate, it is through the method of queer reading the Colonial Archive that we have been able to do that. So I would insist on the fact that it has the capacity of queer studies and queer methods to actually inform architectural historiography. Similar case is this with this painting as well. We have been able to locate and also using this image draw upon and uh, densify and inform the footprint that we were creating of the Machi Bhavan area. And again, more projects like this. Um, okay. Um, this is the Imambara. We are all familiar with Imambara. Now, when you look at this image, how many of you have been to Lucknow? If you and so you remember that Imambara from the long, tiny thing like this, like maybe on the other side, but this is a more familiar scale to you. Now, but look at this. This is what is in terms of like uh, if somebody wanted to like showcase a building which is very important, then like you would adorn it and but this is happening on the side which does not even have an access. You can't access, there is no access here. This is like 2 stories ditch after the, I mean there is like an embankment and then there is the ditch. So why would anybody do that? And so these are the things that we don't want to simplify it, but it does appear in our argument of disorientation. And yeah, there is an image here. Now, this is the erased part after the demolitions, but this image is before that. And you can see that this is where the Imambara actually faced the city. And even though there was never an entry, so for them it was not important. The entry did not have to align with you know, the decorations. The decorations were for the people who are living on this side of the city, and that side is the entry. And why that entry is because it was a piece of land that was given to Asaf, and he had to make it familiar for himself. So it was a it was an urban insert for him, if you like to call it like that. Like, um, sorry, I'm going back. I'll just take 2 minutes here. So this is the Imambara. He was given this piece of land, and these were all existing structures in which he created, like, his buildings. So we have buildings by Asaf, buildings before Asaf, and buildings after Asaf. So this was Imambara. You see, you're familiar with this land, but this was a point which was facing the river, sorry, the city, and that was very important for him. Um, yeah, similarly, Kesar Bagh, same studies and so on and so forth. And here, when you look at these images, you see vineyards, you see the Lanka, and you see more pavilions, and you see buildings with half domes and so on. But these are all no longer existing. And more images, like you see the Kabutar Khana and like masjids and so on. And we have been again, like, I will not go into the details, but this was a market place, arcade and marketplace, which gets revealed because it was destroyed. And so this helps us read where the market was, and we reconstructed it. Again, more details. This is the Mermaid Gate. Sorry, this is not a mermaid. This is the first entry into the Kesar Bagh. I'll not dwell on that. I'll dwell on this image. This is the Mermaid Gate, and this is what can also be seen in terms of its expression, queer, because there is the seal of the Nawabs were mer persons, like it was also not mermaid, it was mermen, mer person, mermaids. And then there is a lot of like cloudiness and all those things. But very interesting are these staircases that don't go anywhere. And these were ubiquitous, again, like because it was a theatrical setting. And these jharokas where there would be dances, people would climb up, do dance, and come down. So you imagine it to be a very, very, you know, active theater set. Some more images in which these were all like, false facades. They were dark, like they gave an impression that there are openings, but they were all false. Um, and yeah, the dreaminess that you can see in the facades and the parapets, again, staircases that don't go anywhere, and the fish seal and all those. Now, coming back to the paintings, so here you can see he's at the center. He's invoked a jealousy between two women, and one has fallen off, and it's like all drama happening. And this, you can read all of this in Parikhana and Ishaqnama. Ishaqnama is a translation of Parikhana in Persian. Parikhana, I was able to read. It's more accessible in Hindi. And so this is what I mean when I say that the backdrop, we can infer it's Kesar Bagh, but it is not. We can infer that it's the aesthetic of Kesar Bagh as Wajid wanted it to be. So the gardens and the pavilions and all those things. And so you can match these things with the actual photographs of Kesar Bagh. So that aesthetic was definitely alive. And we are using these paintings to then create what Kesar Bagh was. Similarly, what how would he carry out the ishq and in intimate settings, which were also very, um, which were more personal. And then, having some, like, what was it on a day-to-day basis, the theatricity. So this is the Falak Sair, which we are arguing it is one of those buildings which he calls the Falak Sair in his Parikhana. And we locate it also in this thing. And so here now again, if it's a ruler, he is wanting to be visible to the female gaze. The female has, women in Kesar Bagh had a lot of agency. They are seeing things, they are sitting and watching while the man is performing. And then again, he does mention all these buildings that are there and all those. This is like he was running a dance and music school, so he invites people to to take an exam before they can be appointed as tutors, and the ones who are giving the exam are Wajid Ali Shah and his students. So they do a jugalbandi with these tutors to say, all right, you are, you have qualified, and so now you can be. So the agency that the women of the Parikhana, the Pari is exercised. We were calling that, like, in one of our chapters we are talking that. And the speciality is very much visible in the paintings. Similarly, like Wajid dancing, and again available as a performer and not as a ruler. He's with the people. It's very striking to say the throne is empty. He's not sitting in the throne here. So his shift of his position from here to there, he's shifting his power, becoming vulnerable. Becoming vulnerable is very much at the core of his ishq, and it appears as in his writings as well. Then he writes about the women who have the have the agency to not be in parda, and this Najmun Nisa was his chief daroga, the chief inspector, or the very important administrative person, and also like some kind of a body guard of Wajid, and also like a confidant. So she is never in parda, and she is walking alongside other palanquin bearers and things like that. And this is like, the gossip session happening in Kesar Bagh, and Wajid is listening to these women gossiping about some other woman, and they're like, okay, give me more, and so this is what we call gardens of social and gender tensions in our chapter, and we talk about like how they were facilitating this kind of um, interaction, transactions, not interactions, transactions. This is like one story in which women would sign the contract to be part of the parikhana, and the consent was taken from the woman, his mother, if the woman was underage. And so there was a contract, and then there was some money transaction that used to happen. So in here, the woman in purple that is going away is the mother who's like consented and like, all right, I'll let my daughter study here and things like that. And you can see Najmunissa always there. We do talk about the spatiality, the carpetedness, and the way the pathas are there, and where Wajid positions himself, and how do these gardens become gardens of social and gender tensions again and again. And this is the nature of demolition that happened. So in dark gray, you can see the British intervention where this massive garden gets, geometricized and regimentalized, and totally like all these roads start to cut across and things like that. And that memory gets erased. And that's how we know Kesar Bagh today. We can't see it as one large quadrangle. We see it as small units. And this is the nature area of demolition, including the Kesar Bagh and the Machi Bhavan. So much of demolition had happened, and the rest of the city was not necessarily destroyed. It was just Asaf and Wajid then. Um, and towards the end of my presentation, you can see like Lucknow Mosque of Imambara, and if you zoom into it, it says it's the mosque, the Asafi Masjid. Here it's called the ammunition store. And you can see all these ammunitions lying here. So this was their way of appropriation. And this is, many of these paintings survive in where the Kesar Bagh is like being pulled down and recklessly pulled down, and there's like violence being inflicted on not just the inmates but also on the structure itself. And we do write about this in great detail.
Thanks, Sonal. I mean, uh, the book has all the images, um, but they're small. And here it was a treat actually to see it in this size. Um, just wanted to kind of slowly uh, go through the process of uh, putting this book together. Like it would have involved archival work, to kind of get all of this. And so so one is about how long does it take to kind of put a work together like this, and when did it kind of start, like the queer conceptualization, how does it, when did it start uh, uh, building up uh, in your work actually of architecture? Of course, uh, both the nawabs, their descriptions are very very clear about their um, themselves, but the how did this conceptualization kind of come about? Like I'm thinking of queer space as a non-gendered space. I mean, if I may, and is it non-gendered? You know, uh, gendered. When I say gendered, I mean uh, space being uncomfortable for certain gender. That's, I mean, at a base level. But does it mean that, and what when does it start kind of, when it start building up for you as a as a as a as a queer, landscape. So that's one part of it. And second part of it, if you can take us through some of the mechanics of, uh, I mean, in your research, uh, of how these buildings were put together. In the sense that, of course, these are buildings which were built before, uh, modern drawings kind of enter into the country. There are no orthographic drawings. There are no, uh, but there are ways in which these buildings are put together in terms of, their. So, uh, what are the agencies involved, and what are the ways in which? So, these are the to begin the conversation.
Um, okay. I to your first question, it's it's not we're not able to put a date to when we decided that this is the project. I think it just evolved, but I think I'll again give a lot of credit to Paul, Arul Paul. Um, I was always interested in queer methods. That was what I was. I mean, that was my experience also in terms of like having access to that scholarship as a PhD student. I was encouraged to engage in that scholarship, but it was only limited to that scholarship. And that scholarship I brought to the studio, and Arul was part of that studio, and he said, all right, now let's look at Lucknow. And through this mechanics, I'm just gonna map the queer spaces in Lucknow. He was very much interested in that. So I think he created a queer map of Lucknow, and it was also drawing upon the queering map that you were talking about in the morning. So, like, just can, and it was not like an online map, but let's see which are those spaces in Lucknow where, which are more comfortable for queer people, and which are the places that are advocating for, or, help centers, and which are then spaces of oppression, like police and police stations and things like that, or access, or where we read about instances where oppressions have happened, or queer people have been subjected to some kind of atrocities. So he was very much interested in mapping those things, and when he put those against like the queer, on the historical layer of the city, he just suddenly saw that a lot of cruising spots are somehow coming, getting overlapped with these spaces. And then that led him to look at Wajid Ali Shah and Asaf-ud-daula. And then, I mean, it just like, I would give a lot of credit to Paul to like, to give this project the beginning. And then we worked together on building the methods, and everything else developed from that. But the initial grain came from just mapping queer spaces in Lucknow from a historical perspective. Coming to the point of what was the way in which these buildings were being constructed during the times, like, so Asa was building in 1790s, and Wajid built only 47 to 57, 10 years. Asaf only built for 10 years, and it is like between him and him, it's like just a matter of 70 odd years, 860, not even that much. And Asaf employed British architects. So he was employing, like for his other Asafi Koti and Bibiyapur Koti, he was employing British architects. So also Claude Martin was a contender, Antoine Polier and all. So they were employing British sensibilities, European sensibilities of creating drawings and, those ways of construction systems. Kesar Bagh was, the architect was not a British or European, it was Chote Mia. So we don't have drawings of that nature, but it may have, we are not able to access those, if there were any drawings or not, so we don't know. Um, yeah, so, yes.
Is that the drawings kind of also put an order, to the thinking of space. And when uh, when the argument is that the order is something which is disrupted, which is kind of deviated from, then what are the mechanics of such deviation? Like, of course, the king is not instrumental in every decision that is being taken. It's the ecosystem which kind of ecosystem of the building which kind of puts it together. So what were the mechanics of that? Whether like and to kind of push that a little bit further, that 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 ecosystem kind of uh, uh, held uh, the queer logics, you know, uh, and provided space uh, for queer lives. So that's the, like, it's a city which is kind of which is providing, uh, and not necessarily only the monarch. So that's what I was kind of pushing to.
No, I think that's a very good question. So, how are these things getting constructed by themselves? And it's not just driven by the monarch. And that is very much evident. Also, I think there is a bias in the book towards Kesarbagh because we have been able to find more material and not so much for Asaf. So, um, in the Kesarbagh, definitely what we again call palaces of plurality is where the women, we do talk about how the women are exercising their agency in trying to see how do they territorialize themselves. There is something which is called, which is a word called kabza. And kabza is used in the Parikhana and in the writing about Kesarbagh, where kabza means control, but it also means like occupation. And Wajid, when he writes in his writings about Parikhana, and again, like we are very cognizant that we are using Wajid's writing, but also because it was Wajid writing, he was also like writing the way he was. So he does use the word that he is interested in creating a space where the women are able to have kabza, like Hindi mein kabza karna, which meant that he was interested in this space that the women will occupy. So not a control in a way. And the kabza happens, and then after that, the tensions emerge because of him. So he is ensuring loyalty. So if you want to do kabza, tumko loyalty dikhana padega. And if you're not interested in me, if you have another lover, you are free to go. But then he like has a lot of this thing that um, it's that ishq thing, like it's like I'm vulnerable and you're doing this to me types. No, so there is a manipulation in that. But he's cognizant of the fact that the kabza, and there is like we find that a very interesting word too that he uses. He also uses the word ghar for the parikhana. Now parikhana we also use. We are saying that it was two things. One, it was the book, and one was the the school that he created within that garden, which was the Parikhana, where the girls would be trained to learn Kathak. And so the Parikhana, he calls it a ghar, which is like a house, a home, uh, which means that there is some kind of comfort and some kind of domesticity that becomes part of the Parikhana. But very interestingly, he also uses the word daftar to talk about Parikhana. Now, daftar is an official, it means office. So there is a transaction. It is both house, home, and office, and a performance space, in which it is only transactional only because both the parties are in a contract, that in agreement that it is transactional. It can only, and that is the beauty of Wajid's politics, is he is not positioning himself above. He's like, my work with you is because we are in a transactional, so it can come from you and from me as well. So there is going to be a tension, but of course I will be at the power, this thing. So, but that power is situated in his vulnerability. So he positions himself at par with his cohabitants and so on and so forth. He's also aware of the gaze of other men on him, and he plays that out in similar fashion. So to answer that question.
One of the things about the book is that it it doesn't get surprised. That's a nice thing about the book, because I shouldn't call Rose Loveland Jones colonial writer, but there's so much surprise in that book that you kind of 374 wives, and then uh, 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 divorcing 10 wives in a day, so there's so much surprise when of course, she goes and explains it later. uh, but then the book, this is and that's what is generous about the book, and the way it kind of looks at the two uh, nawabs. It doesn't get surprised. It's kind of it kind of folds very well the everyday of Lucknow, and its life and moralities and ethics and all of it together. uh, I wanted to kind of spend a little bit time on Kaiserbagh, and Wajid Ali Shah's Kaiserbagh. My first introduction to Kaiserbagh was through Rose Loveland Jones' book, and it was. I mean, there is much more description of Kaiserbagh in this. Uh, in the last Nawab, in the last King of India, uh, that book kind of takes up Kaiserbagh and kind of discusses uh, the performance that go on for days and days and days, and it's a because Wajid Shah is also writing plays, and he's also a composer of poems, and he invites his audience to spend weeks and months in Kaiserbagh, and during those weeks and months, they're basically it's a performance that's going on, you know and this book opens up Kaiserbagh in a very, very nice way. And what she said just now, the house and the office, daftar, the ghar and daftar, and the school and the theater together, the whole, and so fascinating will its type be then, because our understanding of type comes from a colonial functional, it has a functional core, that a daftar should have a set of rooms, a corridor, and the way the rooms are structured around each other and stuff like that. How did you, I mean, what did you all make a plan of Kaiserbagh finally, or did you all kind of, how did you all open up the type of it? Tell us more about Kaiserbagh.
Yeah, we have made a plan of Kesarbagh. And we have also contested a lot of Rosie Levlin Jones's claims about also that painting that I showed in the beginning. um, so she does talk about, the theatricity and the con- continuous, perpetual theatricity, definitely. But how we add to that is we also say that these were the spaces at which this was happening, and the and also I do have an advantage of actually being able to read Parikana myself. So reading Wajid himself, like he is saying that I am writing this Marcia, and he does talk about the Gizla and that play that he writes, and the Maruk Pari being, and that there is this competition between his wives to play the Gizla and so on and so forth. And he describes the pavilion in which this thing plays out, and how the shamianas and the fanas are played, which are the chandeliers and the lamps and so on and so forth. It's a very deep description of that, and he's very descriptive. So those descriptions help us imagine those pavilions. But what Ishaq Nama helps us do, the later book that he does after the Parikana, which has commissioned paintings. And so those paintings are an interpretation. It's happened in, like, just 1 or 2 years. Those paintings help us spatialize the story. And so it has been very tedious, like very tedious to go through And these are books that do not come with indexing and all that. And and what is very interesting is that Maruk Pari somewhere is Maruk Pari, but somewhere it is the title gets changed, because by the time Ishaq Nama is written, that Maruk Pari becomes Maruk Mahal. So it's very difficult. You can't even keep track of the names and so on and so forth. So we had to do a very tedious reading of Parikhana, having related it to the Ishaqnama, which is in Persian. We could only get the titles translated. It's very expensive to get translations done. And then comparing it to the paintings and the stories and back and forth. So that is how we were able to actually do a fairly good job of like confidently saying that these might have been the pavilions. The things that we have not been able to locate, we've not been able to locate. But we have created a to the scale drawing of Kesar Bagh. And that is where I would reiterate, we use the conventional architectural tools to say that, queer methods are contributing to this construction of history the way you and I know it, the familiarity that comes from the profession, the discipline itself.
Push you a little bit on that, because the um, the miniature ways of doing things, the miniature painting ways of doing things, in which you have uh, you have various projections on the same, you have the plan and the section, the whole elevation, all on the same drawing, as a part of the same drawing. And I mean, those methods are interesting because you sense space uh, in in a little bit more elaborate way than a simple plan. So I was thinking if you all experimented with that also, in terms of uh, putting things together.
We did. And again, here is where I'll just like take an easy way out. It's like we at some point during the course of our project, we realized they are only going to publish black and white drawings. So then we thought, let's abandon it and just like stick to simple line drawings. And but we have that, and also some of the drawings that we that came out very beautifully were queer elements in Kesar Bagh, and they were very neon, pastel, overload kind of drawings. Those drawings also we had to abandon because they were very strictly black and white. So we said, all right, we'll just like, we have it there. We also have an excess of 50,000 words, and we have one more Nawab like we have it already, so maybe it's the next project. So yeah, I mean, it was like very, very disheartening that we could not bring those drawings to this book, also because the scale and um, it was like some kind of a limitation, and we at some point just let it go. It's fine, like let's not go in that direction.
I have many questions actually. So, but want to open it up to others who are. I know the book is new. You all haven't kind of uh, got into it, but uh, there's plenty from her talk and the images. Any responses? I mean, it's a sorry.
Uh, Hi. Uh, First of all, thank you so much for this talk. I mean, the school has been introducing us to a lot of similar topics in the last 2 years with our allied courses, and this talk just added more to it. Uh, so, my question was, when an archive talks about queer or queerness in adjectives like eccentric or bizarre, it sort of is setting up a norm almost that says queerness is something that is different than what is considered normal. So then where and how does this then positions say an archivist or someone who is writing about queer history in terms of like being disorganized or say non-aligned in ways of seeing uh, that does not alienate it from how that does not alienate from being incorporated into one's everyday and avoid looking at it in a different stream of being, like it is something else to exist like that. So I mean, I did not sort of understand where words like non-aligned or bizarre are taking it towards normal. I feel like it is taking queerness further away from what people consider to be normal.
So thank you for that question. Words like bizarre and I think your question is very valid, and I think that was the beginning point of the project. Like at some point, it critiques. It's not the critique; it actually enables us to access the archive, the colonial archive, because, like and we write about the archive, like how are archives like institutions that are by their nature very exclusionary, because there is a certain amount of curating, then curating, and then you have keywords which like give you access to things and so on and so forth. And then the keywords are also searchable keywords and so on. There is that politics. Now, when we are reading the archives, we are coming across these words a lot, and these are synonyms of the word queer. I agree, and it does reinforces further. But what it allows us to do, and that is the weapon of the queer method, it reclaims those words. It's the weapon is the reclaiming. It's the words that we reclaim, and we do a control F into the documents and start finding. And because we are not reading like line by line, we are doing a control F, and the control F brings us an enormity of that word bizarre, say for example. And we did that, like again and again. For each of the document that we were finding, we were doing an enormous search with these keywords in the sense like synonyms of the word queer, and we did come across a lot of things. And so that is how is the reclaiming of the thing that in your words, it's removing itself further away from the normative, that we are saying you're using it as a weapon to start seeing that, all right, this is queer and its synonyms, and so now let's see what is it in it that is making it queer and bizarre, and let's celebrate it. So that, and there was another thing I wanted to say, but I just lost my train of thoughts. I'll come back to it. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Sonal, thank you. I think I'm just so much more eager to read the book now. And your slides, I echo Prasad that, because the illustrations, the drawings are so much drawing us into that world that it really invites a very, very engaged and an engaging way to inquire about the Nawabi architecture. And I think the strength of your work from what you just presented and were in conversation with is also how cleverly you're calling it a queer reading of Nawabi architecture and the Colonial Archive, because I think the strength of your project is in the interpretive lens and the kind of interpretive lens that lends itself to a method and opens itself up to a dialogue. So it's not ascribing fixity, but it really offers a reading. And you do that phenomenally, looking at the texts closely, but also looking into the drawings even more closely. But I wanted to sort of ask you, it's a twofold question. And this goes back to when you were beginning to describe the gardens of gender tensions, the piece where you begin to describe gossip and the idea of women and a women in conversation with the Nawab, but about the other women. And I'm at how conscious were you to not reproduce a normative gaze? So what becomes of the gossip? The gossip itself is a normative construction because it ascribes a certain kind of femininity to who gets to gossip. And I'm just thinking in terms of your writing, how were you also simultaneously conscious of not reproducing the normative gaze in that interpretation?
Um, I think we were very conscious as much as we could. And I think, again, collaboration helped because one person would keep the other person in check. And so, yes, we were very conscious. And like, so this was one example in which, and again, because it's Wajid himself writing that, you know, he is interested in what women are talking. And so he would say that I would like go and talk to people, and I'm like sitting in this closed room and I'm like very sad, and because this person cheated on me and I'm not feeling well. So he writes, you have to read that Parikha, like, you know, and you know, so it navigates these things which are like full on sleaze, and then there are these like moments where like, what the hell, is like this guy is just ageist, and you know, also like at some point a pedophile, and at some point there's all these things that are happening. But then if you just go past that, like what is at the core of this person's politics, so we trained ourselves to like just pay attention to that. Now, Gardens of Social and Gender Tensions is something which is also, there are moments in which you know, you see examples in which homoerotics start to appear, and the women start becoming like close allies, like as friends and also as lovers. And it appears in Wajid's case also, and in one of the earlier harems in Nasir's. Like we were not able to include that because of the word limit, but it was very much a prevalent thing. It was not prevalent, but it's like so in the writings of Ajit that also appears. And for him, that is because he is the center. So any deviation, he can be at the center of all attentions, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientations. But nobody else could be. But he's aware that these things start happening. And so there are instances. It's not like he has one narrative for every. In one instance, he's like, all right, if you are not in agreement with this contract, then you just go. I don't want, and what he calls dishonest and farebi, he calls fareb. Agar fareb karna hai to nikal jao types. Huh? So for them, it is like the fareb he can't tolerate. But in other cases, he coerces people to like not do things. So there are these, you know, landscapes that he navigates, or like, you know, and he's aware that these things are happening. And so it's not, again, the control is not his, the kabza is with the women who occupy. And how we are writing about is that Kesar Bagh, even though it was envisioned by one guy, it starts to take on um, its own life, which facilitates these kind of erotics and friendships. Jealousies is very much part of the erotics as well.
Thank you. And my sort of connected question was, and you're very clear in terms of who the book is written for, and you call it a book, making a methodological contribution to the field of architecture, to the discipline of architecture, using the tools of architecture, but to provide a different kind of an analysis, a reading, an interpretation, but also an experience. But because it's a queer reading of Nawabi architecture, I want to sort of now pose a question of how does it contribute to queer theory? And sort of, you know, I'm reminded of this 2005 introduction to what is queer about queer theory now, which had Jack Habstom and Jose Esteban Munoz taking Judith Butler's 1993 text, Critically Queer, and really invoking this idea that for those of us who are queer, who write queer theory, and those who are interested in queer theory, um, must be attentive to how queer moves through time, and keep queerness radical. So I'm curious if you could reflect on how is this writing keeping that project of queerness radical?
It's a difficult question. I really want Paul to be here to be able to answer that. Um, I don't know if I can answer that question, but one of the things that we try and do is invite our readers and also people who would be navigating or who would experience these places at some point by experiencing it through their body. And so the way the sequencing is happening when we write either about Machi Bhavan or about Kesar Bagh, it is in a sequence and it is always written in the way our bodies would be oriented. And in certain places where the building exists, we orientate ourselves, Paul's and I's, our body, to then write about it. So in our orientation, in relation to that, we write, and we also invite the reader to be oriented to like move along with, so it becomes like some kind of experience in a sense, like, and it's not for us to know or to even like, you know, predict or choreograph somebody else's experience, but it's just in the sequencing and that we are aware and we write about the embodied orientation and disorientation. And in the orientation, we are also aware that some things get like lost or like go out of um, the peripheral vision, and so it may just be forgotten and then it starts to appear again. So it is, I think, I'm not sure if it really answers your question of radical, keeping the radical queerness alive, but I think that is the nearest answer I can give you to that, like in terms of inviting our readers to be aware of their own orientations while they are reading the book like that way, and also the places.
Thanks, Sonal, for the wonderful talk. I've just purchased this. I'm going to read it.
Thank you.
Now, I mean, I was drawn to your work as a methodological intervention. I kind of started thinking about um, uh, uh, the queering of space as a methodological engagement very recently. I've been kind of studying uh, I've been studying Adivasi hamlets in the Sanjay Gandhi National Park. And, you know, when I started my work, I used to make the flagrant mistake of calling their habitation or that landscape as a forest. And each time I mentioned the word forest, I was insistently told what you call a forest is our garden. And it hit me after actually some time. I mean, twice or thrice I didn't register. It was my kind of taking things for granted about what is being kind of, you know, how I'm kind of imagining that place. But at some point it did hit me very hard that there is something being told to me over here to change my ways of imagining this space itself. And I started looking at, you know, I started reading the ways in which gardens have been conceptualized and written about, and one kind of encounters the Mughal garden as a pleasure garden. So in many of the works, the Mughal garden has been kind of written through historically as an imagination of a space for pleasure that originates in Persia, travels to Rome, and also via the Mughals to India and comes to India. But in many of the writing, even but I mean, particularly if I have to kind of mention Elizabeth Monyan's work, that the garden, the Mughal garden is seen as a space which is a space where order of the world is kind of constructed. And order in many of those writings where a heteronormative kind of space gets constructed, a clear distinction between the inside and the outside kind of gets made. And what your work does when you talk about the type of home, house, workspace, it troubles those kinds of, divisions or separations. So I was just wondering, because a part of your book kind of talks about the social and gendered tensions in the garden. If you could kind of talk to the space of the garden, and is the space of pleasure uh, troubling the heteronormative kind of space? Because when British modernization kind of comes to us, the idea of public space is to construct a space of civility. Gardens become a part of that imaginary in a very big way, which we've kind of drawn upon. They've become a language of our development planning vocabulary. So if you can talk to it, that.
Okay, thank you for asking that question. So here I could answer the question using Kesar, but I'll just like not do that. I'll use this opportunity to talk about another garden, which was the Hussain Bagh. And that was part of the Machi Bhavan of Asaf-ud-daula. Now, one of the earliest travelers who came to Lucknow, William Hodges, he writes about that garden, and he writes about these things in terms of his olfactory and his sensorial experience of that garden, and he's very like put off by the, like, I don't remember the exact quote, but it's somewhere there, and he says that he's just put off by the sheer disorganization of the colors in the garden. Like, there's just like anywhere and everywhere. And he's also put off by the strongness of the smell. He's like, my body can't take it, that kind of thing. And so there is that thing about those gardens that are not necessarily laid out. But when you see these depictions, the archival depictions of those gardens, there are these cypresses and they are very well laid out. And so what is happening here, and that's what the queer reading allows us to do, is Asaf commissions essentially European painters, and he commissions them to create paintings. Wajid commissions people who were rejected by the East India Company to write his counter archive. But Asaf appoints Europeans to create paintings for himself and project his authority in the world, because he wanted to be the person of the world and citizen of the world and so on. So the imagination which we read of those places is very divested from the paintings that appear. So that is one way in which we can see that there is a distancing between, the colonial visualization versus the experience. And there are instances, there is the Sangi Dalan court and all that, in which there are mentions in Persian writings of the time of Asaf where there were swings and women would be just like playing, and there were hammams. And then there is an English writer who comes and he's very much he writes about his experience of that hammam, and he's like, oh my god, this is like just amazing, and so on and so forth. And it's very close to the Zanana area, so there are these overlaps. And the mosque looking into the Zanana area of that courtyard, which is Hussain Keshani writes about these things that they had to be separated, but here they are not. And so he speculates that it was in between time before Asaf could actually have a new palace. But we are very much interested in that time where the overlaps are constantly happening. It was never a neat segregation as you very correctly pointed out, that, you know, it's not a very romantic imagination of a paradise. In Lucknow, it was not like that.
Because what comes, I mean, I asked that because what comes to us from the Western kind of readings, Adam and Eve committed their sin in the paradise garden, whereas some of the material that you kind of described over here speaks about a very different kind of imagination. So in many of the works, I was kind of, curious about it. So thanks for opening this out. I mean, I have two points connected to this. Methodologically, I want to kind of ask, uh, as a queer reading, as a queer lens to make an intervention, how does a queer lens or a queer methodological engagement in the last, I mean, I want to kind of think through some of the, I mean, I've again not read the book, so I'm kind of trying to just think out loud. We've seen architectural histories that have come out, particularly in the um, um, you know first decade of the 21st century, which kind of mobilized the tropes of multiple modernity, hybrid modernity, so on and so forth, in thinking about the making of colonial cities, which have been kind of become um, interventions into thinking about the space, the colonial space that the British kind of, imagined over here. Does the queer lens or a methodological engagement make an intervention into these debates? And if so, how does it do that? I'm kind of pointing to the work of Swati Chattopadhyay's work on Calcutta, William Glover's work on Lahore, or the work on Delhi, which is, I forget the author's name, but another woman.
Jyoti
Jyoti
Husagra.
Usha.
It's an interesting question. Trying to see how we can answer that, because we don't necessarily write about the colonial spaces, but I'm sure we must have come across some anecdote of or how, your question is how does the queer method allows or facilitates us in reading spaces, in reading colonial spaces. Um, Project of modernity. So yeah, project of modernity is like, yeah, definitely, like, you know. So I will again like use the example of Asaf, and I think all right, I think I should be able to answer that substantially, like to some extent, like um, so a colonial project or a modernity project, one of the typologies of those projects was museums, or like there was a lot of, like the colonial project was a lot about inventorying, a lot about map making, a lot about like taking you know like you know taking stock of things that you could colonize, in terms of quantifying, in terms of qualifying what is colonizable. And so a lot of these maps that we see, also the war maps and so on, they are colonization projects. They're also modernity projects, because they are now also like, the scientific names, classifying botanical species, zoological species, they're all part of the colonization, modernization, modernity projects. So a museum, if you use museum as that typology, and libraries and things like that, which are very much, or even the archives, they are very much dependent on this call number, accession number, and the way you position books and things like that, they all appear in that. And Karen Burns writes about it, where she's like, where do I put my scholarship? It does not appear, it is not entirely this and not entire. where is that library where these kind of scholarships can appear? So she starts to contest the clean classification categories of the modernity colonization project. And Asaf inadvertently at the time, even when queer theory was not necessarily like the way we talk about it, he was exercising it when he was making that Aina Khana, and sometimes it's called the Ina Khana, and Europeans write about it as a museum without it having, it's an odd museum because it's not inventoried. He's so stupid, he doesn't know how to even like categorize things and classify things and put them in shelves and so on and so forth. And so it appears to them like a curiosity thing. And what Asif is doing is like he's understanding that to be a citizen of the world, he has to, does he assert his position and superiority over these guys is by, his way of, one of the ways of his doing it is to do what they do in his way. And so the collection of not just things, but also people from all over the world to draw for him to do that was his way of, subverting that colonial space. So Ina Khana or the Aina Khana is doing a lot of these things.
So thank you for the presentation. And it was interesting for me because I always intend to place myself in the conversations happening about queerness. So for me, I don't have a question, but I have like a comment. Like it was interesting to think about how queer architecture becomes its quote unquote outrageous vulgar self. Like there's an idea that queerness always exists, having a rebellious nature. Like as you've said, like the nawabs wanted to uh, make the colonial gaze uncomfortable and not having shoes and paintings, etc. It's almost as if queerness has always had an ambition to be more outrageous and flamboyant and dramatic, to stop being understood and rationalized by what others them. Uh, I mean, then it's interesting to think about how being othered and the trauma that comes with it has shaped people and the form of queer architecture, text, art, etc.
Yeah, thank you. And we are, although not necessarily talking about, sorry, what you did talk about trauma and the othering, but there was something else you also said prior to that.
Yes. Queerness always has had an ambition to be more outrageous, to stop itself from being understood and rationalized by what
Yes.
others done.
Yeah, so it's the queerness and that it's evasiveness to be like, defined and contained is something which is very beautiful and also very powerful. And we did have, Paul and I had these conversations every single day. I think that do we really need to define it? Because the nature of queerness is that it will always evade those definitions. And we did think that let's define so that it can still continue to evade those definitions. And I think that is where it starts to become like maybe it continues to be radical. I don't know, like, but that was like what we were trying to get at, and not really. Our intention was not to contain and define it that this is queer, but just like through this reveal the capacities that it will always exceed these representations. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It was really, really amazing in the way it kind of opened up the space of the flamboyant, the erotic. You could see like the Wajid Ali's the slit in his dress with his nipple, sort of peeping out of his out of the dress. So I mean, there's kind of flamboyance, and some of it you can also see in the drawings. And you say that, you know, some of them are commissioned. You know, they're also commissioning the British to do it. So there's a kind of a way in which British representation also then was co-opted, right? In sort of drawing this kind of aesthetic ecology, right? So I'm just curious, and I know you answered that a little bit as a logistical project, you know, of not having enough colored pages and other things. But I'm just kind of want to push you a little bit in terms of really thinking about what it is, what does it mean then to redraw plans? You know, is that in any way, you know, hijacking the kind of cartographic drawing in similar ways that Wajid Ali was asking, you know, the British to draw. Does it open up anything in a kind of method of queering? Is there something about scale, proportion? Is there a kind of forensics of reading that you can draw? Or is it just then going back to an architectural representation of, you know, drawing maps and plans and sections? So I just want to push you a little bit in terms of what does it do, you know, for the queering project?
I think it was at the end of the day a very conscious choice to stick to the conventional forms of drawing. And because there's so much unfamiliarity and there's so much of disturbance that we are creating in the rest of the project, that we wanted to like anchor it through this thing which is very conventional. And also in that sense, that was also our way, maybe successful or unsuccessful, in trying to maybe like, you know, bring this thing into quote unquote the mainstream, like, you know, the normalization of this thing, so that then it can have its own life again. It can be, you know, open to further queer reading and so on and so forth. But and we do in very brief way to talk about, again, using Sarah Ahmad's vocabulary, to talk about the familiar, unfamiliar. We use familiar, unfamiliar in various ways, but also in terms of drawings, we do talk about the familiarity of the convention. But again, like, you know, the neon drawings, and we could not like work with the colors at all. But I think that was like, you know, and yeah, and I mean, taking on from here, like moving on to other projects, and how um, and this is where I'll just speak for myself, because in other projects I'm now gravitating more towards planimetric drawings and so on, and where I'm experimenting with other forms of representation. But here in this case, we just like
Yeah, I mean,
stick with it.
sorry, just want to kind of push that a little bit further, because I mean, I don't mean to say that, you know, so then you start doing drawings which kind of mix plan, section, elevation, because we've seen a lot of that also becoming stylistic in some ways. You know, it's kind of this representation of what would have been Indian, or the way somebody would have drawn you know, at this time. But I'm also thinking of, say, forensic architecture, which uses SketchUp, for example, you know, to start really kind of reading into that space of violence. What was the what was the trajectory of the missile? Where did it come from? So in some ways, it becomes it hijacks this kind of process of drawing to read something else into it, you know. So I'm just wondering if there is more to that. I mean, it's not just kind of falling back on the conventional, but using the conventional to read something else into the
Yeah,
space.
so I think we are using the conventional to not read, because the reading is coming from, you know, the others' works, but the using the convention to then write what was the unconventional. But yes, definitely, like and so I think it is pretty much like using the convention to center, to to I will put it in a different way, like maybe, and that has been the buzzword in the panels today, across 2 days, which is about occupying and claiming space. And so this was we can argue that it is, we've not said it, it's just like I'm thinking aloud and you are helping me think aloud, is to be able to claim that center stage of architectural discourse, architectural historical discourse, by using their convention and using that language. Like we use other language, but then to situate ourselves, we are using that language, which is the convention, and that's how I would say it.
No, it's that the first was it the first painting, that the nipple popping out. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic, and that stayed with me as well. It's almost like asking me what, again, that keeps the project of queerness alive for me. So what is an architectural equivalent of the nipple popping out and never being sort of, you know, be apologetic or be roped into the ideas of convention. So I think, and again, I may be completely wrong because I've not read the book, but because the book tries to use tools which are off the profession, there's a danger perhaps to then limit the possibility of what a queer theorization of whether it's modernity or even architecture might be. So I'm just saying that I think the audience of the work is much more of the conventions, so then it relies on conventional tools. And then, going back to Audre Lorde's, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so how do we then think of our tools differently to be able to then contribute to queer theory? But I think that's not your project, because you said it's a queer reading of what is the Colonial Archive. And because you're, again, very, very clever in calling it a queer reading, so then we as readers are in engagement with each other. And somebody else might take up this project and say, okay, now what about it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, I mean, thanks for the book and the presentation, firstly. I kind of had a question away from, questions of architecture. So the book sort of starts off with setting itself, like it's a queer reading of the Colonial Archive, and then you sort of enter this world of the two nawabs. And I wanted to sort of add like the question of power into it. And I mean it in the sense of like the moment you start, showing the paintings, talking about the Ishqnama, it almost starts reading as like a document on statehood, like Machiavelli's Prince, where, each of the image almost has a certain, lesson about how does one run a state, or like even Kaiserbach in some sense is, because the concept of politics there is ishq, right, where it's sort of this mix of theatrics, of power, of love, all of it sort of coming together. And so, there's gossip, right, there's jealousy, there's sort of, parts of it that talk about, or you've written about it, like, putting certain figures into important positions who were in some sense in a kin relationship to him. He's also at the center of the story in many ways. So I was wondering, it's also in that sense really a document about, statehood. And I was wondering if that sort of comes, like if, if there's at points where like the nawabs. So how do you sort of navigate that question of power, particularly when you're writing about nawabs and the documents? And nothing that's in this. This is more to think about also how does one read the Ishqnama and. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
So, statehood, Ishqnama is very interesting. I wouldn't read Ishqnama completely for it to be a statehood document, simply for a very simple reason, and it was written when he had not come to power. he was still a prince. And it is autobiographical, and I said it is a very uncomfortable reading in the first go, until unless you realize his intentions. It's like it's autobiographical, and it's crazy. Like, how does he remember all these women that or people that he had been with? So it seems to me like that it was a constant diary that he was keeping, and he must have started keeping that diary at a certain point. Nobody has written about it, and I don't know. There is no, way to verify all these things, but um, he does mention the ascending to the throne of Nasiruddin, who was his grandfather and his father, but not himself. And so there is a certain timeline to that. But his other projects, like the Awadh Catechism, his reply, so the British wrote a blue book, which was written by the last resident, William Sleeman, and he like writes to the Queen, and so all these guys, they had to make a case of like removing the rulers here, and also like cutting off their pensions and all those projects. So William Sleeman writes a very thick book, like along with that guy Dalhousie, and where they are like, itna, all these, there's so many, burglaries that are happening. People don't have to eat. There is like drought, all these things that are there. And he writes a reply to the blue book, and it's called the reply, and he does it in two formats. One is a book, and one is a reply, which is a condensed form that he sends to Queen Victoria, which is highly illustrated. It's written in beautiful Persian with a lot of, that illuminated manuscripts, this daipka. And so in that, he uses the same words as Sleeman. While Sleeman is writing about his thing, he uses the same, and he invokes the same kind of, um, language to urge the Queen's justice and all that, to say, hey, like, you have to be just and look at what all this. So those are the statehood projects. And there he is also very, very, very strongly saying that ठीक है, अगर स्लीमन ये बोल रहा है कि हमारे यहाँ पे इतनी होती है, तो स्लीमन, all the EIC territories have so many dakitis and all that, and this is where, so with facts and figures, he's writing all those things. So they are more appearing as statehood projects, and there are many more that he does. And one more thing, like Asaf ki case mein, the British had employed one person who was a Persian-speaking person who was not in good terms with Asaf, and Asaf had like removed him from office. British employ him to write a history of Awadh from a local perspective, and that's how it's titled. Wajid does the same thing. He hires somebody who's called Bird, and then Museed karke ek tha, who were under the EIC, and they were very angry, and they were like removed from service. So he hires them to write his projects in English. And so those are the statehood projects that he commissions, and he also like proliferates them in the world. I'm not very sure about Ishaqnama. It's like I can't vouch for that to be a statehood thing.
Thanks. I mean, yeah. Actually, so many, and there are so many books on Indian princes. Actually, in the last 10 years, most recent one is this Zabriskie, John Zabriskie is dethroned. The whole idea of where you kind of, where you are kind of, I mean, he's a tall scholar also, but it's kind of, you're unsure as to how the rendering of the prince and their politics as against the British, taking over, and subsequently the Indian state taking over. So and how do you place them? Uh, they are basically they're powerless, and the way they kind of work work is through all these desires and their, all these excesses that they kind of practice. So a lot of these books kind of fall into that narrative of the Indian princesses being either in their excessive state, or they kind of uh, scheme against the British and this kind of a thing, or the narrative of how the British takes over or the Indian government takes over. The most recent, the fashionable thing is now Patel and Menon, take their narratives of the Indian princely states being taken over. I think, I think I think this book kind of, I think in its mobilization of the queer queer reading, I think it's also a, uh, it also kind of locates the acts of Indian princes in their role in the decolonization process. The kind of in the in their in the in their ways of, and Wajid Ali Shah, of course, at I mean, the British really don't know what to do with him actually at that. It kind of, it's is and I would come back to this whole idea of the ecosystem which holds and which holds queer lives, as well as, gives space and nurtures, instead of one deviant or one, but it's a ecosystem which kind of, where the queer is, and and uh, and in many ways, uh, the colonial enterprise kind of, tones it down. It's not anything else, but it's a colonial enterprise which kind of, gives it a different meaning. So I mean, there are many things to talk about the book, and I would just say, please, read the book. It's fascinating to kind of relocate, and it's about Wajid Ali Shah and Asaf-ud-daula, and it's about Ishaq Nama and Parikhana. It's about Lucknow actually. So, and what a way to kind of start the first, talk from the lives of Wajid Ali Shah and Asaf-ud-daula. So I think it's a thank you again, Sonal, for, and thank you, Paul, for giving us this book, very important for architectural studies, queer studies, uh, and I think I don't want to be nationalist about it, but uh, Indian scholarship kind of, because there aren't much writings. There is one, uh, the on the princely state of Travancore there is a book, but otherwise there are not much books from Indian writers actually. So it's a, it's very important. It's a big step. So please, it's a very important book. It's there. You can take it. You can order it from Amazon also. It's there.
So, thank
Yeah.
you. Don't order it from Amazon. Amazon. Amazon has the UK version. It's like prohibitively expensive. And so Paul and I actually took it upon ourselves to make it accessible to the Indian audience at a very affordable price. So we are like, whatever is the price on the book is what we are charging. So if you want, like, please feel free to like take off it from here. But if you are still like, if there are people who did not get a copy and they were interested, I will send it across to you. So yes, please, if we have tried to write it in a very accessible language, and so, but thank you, Prasad, thank you, Rupali, thank you, Siti, thank you, each one of you, thank you, Prasad, for giving access to the space and be able to present Paul and my work. Thank you so much.
The next CCT is on the 10th of December. Nihal Pereira with his book on public spaces. He's a Sri Lankan scholar based in US. He's coming visiting us with his book. That's on 10th. Thank you.